of the political conclusions, although you will see from the commentary that I rather would employ a different framework to get to these conclusions. So in my comments on David's intriguing paper, I will discuss the two main categories of his analysis. Thus, I will proceed in two steps. First, voicing some skepticism about his usage of the term political violence, and then about human sovereignty. What is the relationship between these concepts in David's paper? If I'm not mistaken, in a nutshell, it is the following. The concept of human sovereignty should help citizens realize their right to participate in a non-violent political process. And this is true not only when confronted with the misguided interference by politically motivated outsiders, although the concept is mainly introduced in order to constrain humanitarian interventions, but equally from co-citizens ready to raise arms. I will first discuss David's main point, namely his distinction between illegitimate political violence on the one hand and legitimate defensive, or what I will call, in a lack of a better term, executive or executing violence on the other. The way David frames his argument leads to the surprising conclusions that no revolution could ever be legitimate. I disagree. The paradigmatic case I have in mind is a regime which is utterly unjust by either violating or even not granting fundamental legal rights. Once all options for achieving a peaceful transformation have been tried and failed, that is, there is no reasoning to be done with this regime anymore, citizens might, under certain circumstances, be justified to raise arms. What they certainly not do in this case, I will argue, is to disrespect the equality and autonomy of the members of government and all the supporters of that government. Secondly, I have some doubts about David's use of the term of human sovereignty, which is ambiguous as to whether it refers to an individual or a political entity. Here I will raise some doubts about whether this new concept is actually necessary and further indicate that it might be seriously misleading as it rather veils the main problem of all sovereignty, namely that sovereignty can always clash with individual human rights. This doubt finally has to do with the uneasy relationship David's human sovereignty entertains with different readings of what it means to have human rights, a concept also prominent in David's paper and one with which he actually starts. So let me come to the main point on the nature of political violence. I think David is certainly correct in arguing that, quote, violence is never a morally appropriate mechanism of political or a collective deliberation, quote end. Violence should, if at all, always follow upon deliberation. That is, should help realize the consensual purposes of a community and not replace deliberation. That is, should help realize, I had that already. But this leaves open the question of what to do under non-ideal circumstances. That is where you tried your best to reach a fully reasonable result, but others will neither listen nor act as you think they must. Thus, justified political violence may try to put fully reasonable deliberative results into practice. If that is correct, it does not follow, as David suggests, that, quote, political violence of any form, quote end, is illegitimate. Rather, David's criticism is only valid for all those political actors who want to circumvent the political process of deliberation by using violence. And there are a lot of cases where this is the case, but I think it's not always the case, and therefore it's too narrow a definition. We may easily think of the help the US provided to overthrow the legitimate regime of Salvador Allende in Chile to make David's point. But there was not even a just cause, so that's an easy case. In other cases, violence is not a last resort because there are still non-violent possibilities available, such as peaceful protest and strikes, etc. But conceptually, it seems to me David's paper too readily forecloses the very possibility of legitimate revolution. David argues that only non-violent politics can be just. The claim is based on too harmonious a picture of politics. David's examples and the ban on political violence have one aspect in common. They all either presuppose a legitimate background order, whose legitimate decisions just have to be backed or executed by violence, or they assume that the existing institutional deficits could be overcome non-violently. But there are a lot of cases, or at least there could be some cases, where political violence serves another function, because there is no legitimate political process in place that could be so circumvented, and violence seems indeed to be the last resort to change the unjust basic structure. In such a case, the revolutionaries try to achieve the genuinely political, I would still think, goal of establishing, quote, just political relations, quote. That is a term David actually embraces. And they would do so by overriding the government's will because it can first be shown to be utterly unreasonable and is second not open to the argumentative dispute David rightly demands. The idealization of the real conditions in which the question of political violence comes up is supported by a further idea, namely that politically motivated violence can neatly be distinguished from violence that defends rights. And I think this is wrong. This dichotomy certainly falls apart once we have to transform an unjust political order and its legal regulations in order to effectively grant or guarantee certain rights that the members of that order should be able to enjoy, and especially those rights that generate their human sovereignty, as David calls it. If the transformation is necessary, we want to change the polity's destiny for the better, and political violence is the only means that will achieve such a transformation, then political violence is necessary in order to defend people's rights. So transformation and defense is actually of one piece here. Sometimes structures have to be transformed, the locus of power has to be reoccupied, and perhaps violently so, in order to achieve an effective protection of rights. This is just the idea of a legitimate revolution, I would claim. Thus, being faced with a just revolution against an extremely unjust government, or even more fundamentally basic structure, which satisfies the criteria of just cause, last resort, or necessity, proportionality and probability of success, as it must to be justified, I actually cannot see how such political violence, quote, overrides or negates the opponent's status as free, equal, and rational moral agents, quote end. It is important to note that these criteria of the just war theory do not, I think, do any work in David's rejection of violent political transformation, but it just grant on this idea of political violence, which I want to reject. So you could make an argument that all or most revolutions can never, for empirical reasons, satisfy these criteria, but that's just a different route that you would then take. Furthermore, although David's typology of 4 kinds of transformative political processes is helpful, but it is misleading in 2 ways. First, political transformations vary in their severity, from just wanting a different political goal within the same constitutional framework. Take, for example, that one party wants universal health care, whereas the other party does not, or up to the other extreme, transforming the entire basic structure of a society, including its political decision procedures. And note that Gandhi, for example, was not pursuing civil disobedience, as he wanted to revolutionize the society, albeit non-violently. And I think that David, when he gives us examples, often refers to political decisions in a very narrow way. So it's like decisions about healthcare or so on. But when he introduces these steps, he actually talks about profound transformations of society. But I think really they are of a different kind, and they are not well accounted for in the paper. Second, and this is my main point, the labeling of the first 2 as green and the latter 2 as red strikes me as deeply problematic. Whereas the fourth is clearly a no-go, the third is, depending on the circumstances, not necessarily so. That's the category of, violent political action. The really important question is under which circumstances citizens might move from the second one to the third step. And just to give you an example, John Rawls, for example, writing on civil disobedience, thought that violations of his egalitarian difference principle do not even justify civil disobedience, as it is too contested, and only violations of the first principle of equal rights justify civil disobedience. So there's already some differentiations. But if the political order is not nearly just as in Rawls' case, but utterly unjust, he also contemplates, even if only in passing, militant resistance as a possibility. But he doesn't really discuss that issue, and I think this issue should be discussed. But in David's framework, one cannot even discuss it anymore. Thus, David does not only claim that armed insurgents should not be helped by external forces, rather they should not be helped at all, even by their co-citizens. Just as a side remark, again, David does not ground this claim on, say, the catastrophic side effects of the bystanding citizens. Rather, he assumes that even an unjust government has a right that all dealings with it should be conducted on non-violent terms. I take that to be a little bit extreme. Now, at points it sounds as if the only violence that could be justified is that used in protection of one's peaceful protests, especially at the later stage. But I think we have to be aware, and I made that point yesterday, that the main right that is violated is not the right to protest in the streets. The real right that is at issue is that one's voice be heard and duly considered within the usual workings of the political process. This is the right violation that finally matters, otherwise people would not protest in the streets, and the goal that decides the issue of proportional use of violence, narrow and wide. So this is the right we should focus on. This brings me to David's idea that interveners should never side with one party. I readily agree with all the poignant ways in which, I hope I pronounced that correctly, so good ways in which David lays out the prudential precautions, such as with rebels, quote, about whom we know very little, quote, end. But is there really a deeper moral reason to abstain from picking winners as a matter of principle? Let us perhaps counterfactually imagine a case where we are extremely certain, and in fact we are justified to be so, that the rebels are, and here I quote David again, virtuous freedom fighters struggling to establish a just civil order, quote end. In this case, I think that along the lines of David's own argument, he should endorse such support because the rebels only try to enable a genuinely just political process that is the human sovereignty David claims we should embrace. And therefore, I think he commits kind of a contradiction in saying, in the name of human sovereignty, we should prevent people from actually trying to achieve human sovereignty. It just doesn't make so much sense to me. So revolutions are supposed to create the very conditions that enable citizens to effectively use the, quote, right to a political process compatible with our status as free and rational moral agents, quote, end. Thus, in a nutshell, I doubt that the citizens of Libya, in principle, only, quote, have the right to attempt political transformations through peaceful protest, quote, end. And perhaps David would say that such revolutions are no examples of political violence, but then I think we are actually usually talking that way, so I'm not convinced. Let me conclude this section, and I'm already running a little bit late, with a thought on David's use of the term war. It is, I think, a bit ambiguous. Initially, David embraces Clausewitz's idea that war would not be the opposite, but actually just the continuation of politics. Later on, he states that political violence and war would be the very opposite of just political relations, which seems to say that the core of politics is nonviolent. So I was wondering, what is the underlying picture of politics here in the end? Furthermore, if merely rights-defending humanitarian intervention should not be called, what about defensive wars? And we talked about that yesterday, and David said, well, perhaps defensive wars shouldn't be called wars at all. Perhaps only the unjust attackers pursuing a political goal would be engaged in war, whereas the defenders are not. Only if they continued the war effort to disarm the opponent could we then talk about war. And actually, I think it's interesting, and Clausewitz actually had the argument that the attacker, as long as nobody defends themselves, are actually not engaged in war. So the war only starts with the defense. And I wonder how that would fit into that picture. But furthermore, wars may be politically motivated, but they need not be. The new wars described, for example, by Mary Kaldor and Herfried Münkler are basically economic wars because they are so lucrative, so people might pretend that they are actually political, have political motivations, but they don't. So should we then also call that not wars, but crimes? I mean, certainly we can come up with a new terminology, but so far I'm not convinced that we should define the term war in the specific normative way David proposes. And I think, if I'm correct, that this is not even a convincing way. We still might use the quantitative definitions that allow us then to distinguish between different kinds of wars and between just and unjust wars on that way. Let me now turn to the idea of human sovereignty. How much time do I have?
Just a few more minutes.
Okay. David admits that the conditional understanding of state sovereignty marks a genuine progress, but should still be replaced by a conception of what he calls human sovereignty. As I understand him, he hereby wants to close an alleged gap. If a conditional state sovereignty is forfeited, one might think that external interveners face no further constraints because those of state sovereignty are no more in place. At this point, the notion of human sovereignty is supposed to insist on the right of the citizenry to manage their own political affairs autonomously without being paternalistically interfered with or even ruled by a foreign intervening state. And I have 3 points that I want to make. The first is about whether we need that kind of term. And here I will just summarize. I think it's not necessary to do so if we make a difference between state sovereignty and the legitimacy of a government. So if a government acts unjustly towards its citizens, it loses its legitimacy to represent and speak for the people on whose behalf it should usually speak. So therefore, this government cannot ward off external intervention that is supposed to help and protect the citizenry, the sovereign. But the sovereign actually still resides within the people. So that's the basic idea, I think, of state sovereignty. So we do not even have to talk about human sovereignty. And in fact, on page 14, David writes, quote, "Crucially, members of a community may continue to possess this positive right even when their government has forfeited its right against forceful foreign intervention." And here he uses government instead of state, and that, I think, makes a difference. There are more complicated cases when we talk about secession, because there, if the government loses its legitimacy, the question is, which part of the citizenry is actually constitutive of a certain sovereignty? But because after this state falls apart, there might be 5 different independent states, so 5 different sovereigns. And I think one problem is that David's usage is perhaps intentionally ambiguous as to whether human sovereignty refers to an individual or a group or a political agent. Sometimes it sounds as if sovereignty was just an aggregate of individual rights, mainly to non-interference, so it's kind of liberal, kind of defensive rights. But sometimes it sounds as if only a specific kind of common political sovereignty was established by forging certain political bonds. So here sovereignty is ascribed to an entity which has been constituted by citizens in a specific way, so there is something new there, not only their old human rights if you would have in the state of nature. And so I think that the notion of sovereignty loses its specific meaning when David talks about the rights of individual as, quote, sovereign. I mean, taking Anand's language here. And within the social contract tradition, very shortly, there are 2 ways of thinking about when a sovereign falls apart, how it works. In Rousseau or Locke, the sovereign is actually only a trustee. It's actually not a sovereign, it's just the government as a trustee. And so if this government is replaced, then the sovereignty falls back to the people, because the people is the sovereign. Whereas in Hobbes, there you really have the sovereign, the monarch, the absolute monarch, is constituting the people, and so if he fails, then the people just disaggregates into individuals, and they are not sovereign anymore. They would have to create it anew. And I think here David has to decide, but if he takes the Lockean or Rousseauian route, which he would probably do, then, as I said again, you don't need this kind of human sovereignty in order to make your point. And the second point which I want to make is that talking about human sovereignty might veil a tension between sovereignty and individual human rights. If we start with the assumption that sovereignty does not only describe that a state should not be interfered with from the outside, but actually there is an agent who could make collectively binding decisions, so it's a supreme authority within a territory, and David actually quotes that, then obviously these decisions can always clash with individual human rights. It would have to be a very harmonious idea of sovereignty that always all rights get granted. So imagine a legitimate authority, say, backed by a majority, and they violate certain, perhaps not as important individual human rights of some minority. How do we want to deal with that? We might say, well, then this state or this government and the majority already lose their right to sovereignty. But I think this is misleading, because where does the sovereignty go? And that doesn't help to talk here about the sovereignty of individuals. I think the best way to say is, well, they might still be sovereign, but they are unjust, and so they are violating human rights. So here I think sovereignty is a much more problematic term, and we might in the end say we have to get rid of it, but we should not include it into kind of fuse individual human rights and sovereignty into one term. And this leads me, to my final point about the relationship between human sovereignty and human rights. And I suppose we gain a clearer picture of what human sovereignty is by looking at the human rights it protects. And there, uncontroversially, David starts with an idea of human rights very narrow. So it's only the 4 R2P crimes that would let a state forfeit its sovereignty rights. And there are 2 readings of human rights in the literature, at least. There is this political conception of human rights embraced by, say, John Rawls, Joseph Ross, Charles Bates, and they say we define human rights by their political function. And the function is exactly to tell us when external intervention is permissible. That's the entire point of human rights talk, which means that our human rights list has to be extremely small, which you can see in Rawls' Law of Peoples, for example. The other camp would say, no, that's a mistake, because human rights gives you a certain resource for internal resistance. So people would say, yeah, okay, perhaps if my political right is violated, that doesn't give the United States the right to intervene, but I can actually do something about it because it's my human right to argue. And I think that in David's paper, human sovereignty is somehow in an uneasy middle position. Because obviously David would only grant the external interveners a right to come in when the 4 R2P crimes are in place. But then he says they should also care about these rights of human sovereignty. And so the idea of human sovereignty seems only to belong to the latter very long list. And in several passages, though, David seems to imply that if a government uses violence and therefore violates the human sovereignty of its citizens, then it actually forfeits state sovereignty. I mean, there are some passages. And then I just wonder, is it internal legitimacy or external state sovereignty, kind of sovereignty towards? I think, to just round up, that would perhaps be a way to go. We could say, okay, these, and I would reframe them as a right to political participation in a nonviolent process. This right can be used in order to justify domestic revolutions, but it cannot be justified cannot justify external humanitarian intervention. And that kind of new framing would then give us also a clue on the difference between inside and outside action. Because throughout David's paper, when he talks about human sovereignty, it's actually the same. You can apply it in the same way to the internal revolutionaries and to the external interveners. But the notion of sovereignty always was supposed to make a difference between internal and external action. And so I would end with that suggestion. Thank you.